This is Chapter 5 on political parties. Let's get started with the questions. The first one is define political parties. And whenever you think about definition, you have to think of three components of a political party. There's party organization, there's party in office, and there's party in the electorate. Now, the party organization are all the people that work for the party when there's an election going on. So they're the public officials in the party, like precinct captains and ward committeemen and people like that, that work in the party at every election. And then there's the volunteers who come and go depending on who the candidates are. So it's everybody, both formally and informally, that work in the party organization whenever there's an election. And people are running from either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. The second thing is the party in office, and that's all the people who get elected under the party label. So when you have these people, so the Democrats who get elected to a city council or the state legislature, then they make up the party in office for the Democrats, and the same thing goes for the Republicans on the other side. And then there's the third component of a political party, and that's the party in the electorate, and that's all the voters who identify themselves as Democrats or Republicans. In this day and age, you have, when people are asked a question by pollsters, what are you, a Democrat, a Republican, an independent, or what? Most people nowadays fall in the category of independent, but all those who identify themselves as Democrats and all those who identify themselves as Republicans are what we call party in the electorate. The other part of question one is, what role does political parties play in the system? And I've listed here four things. They help to simplify choice. That is to say, if you didn't have parties, or if you had multiple parties, it's possible that you could have a whole bunch of candidates at one time. Now, you see that kind of thing in a primary, where there's a number of candidates, like, for example, when you see presidential debates, you may see as many as 10 or 12 candidates on the stage at one time. But the role of the party is to limit or to make sure that only one person, and in the end, represents the party before the election. So during the nomination, yes, you have a whole bunch of people, but it comes down to one Democrat and one Republican when the nomination is completed. So that's what I mean by simplifying choice. You could have a whole bunch of candidates, and then the voter would be somewhat confused as to who to vote for because they wouldn't know who all the candidates are. And with only two parties, you only have two candidates. So that's what's meant by simplified choice. Another thing is they help to unite the electorate. That is, America is a very diversified country, a lot of different opinions and so on. And it's argued that the electorate is made up, when you look at either the Democrats or Republicans, of a lot of people with differing points of view. Now, that's becoming less and less the case these days, where especially I would say in the Republican Party, where the conservatives and the Tea Party and all that crowd has dominated the party, so that you don't have what you used to have back in the day, which would have been like the liberal Republicans. For example, the people who were back in the 1960s representing the Republican side of the liberal politics, people like Rockefeller and people of that nature in New York, were very liberal. And you don't see that anymore. Parties tend to be more homogeneous. So uniting the electorate isn't as useful as it once was as a role. They present issue positions, and there is something to that the Democrats and Republicans take different positions on the issues. you can see that throughout if you pay close attention to any election, that there are some differences between the parties. A lot of people complain that there's not enough, and that on many issues they seem to be the same, but in fact there is some differences, like basically it's the conservative position versus the liberal position. And then the last thing is said about the government, and this is pretty important, and it also is viable, and that is that they unify the government. So if you look at the governmental structure, whether you're looking at state government or local government or national government, it's diversified. Party power is divided up into executive, legislative, and judicial branches. You can even add bureaucracy in there. We'll talk more about that later. But in essence, when you have parties, the parties unite those branches if and when the party has a majority in the executive, legislature, and even in the judicial branch. They unite the government, so the government speaks more of one voice rather than Democrats and Republicans fighting each other. So if the legislature is made up of a majority of Republicans, the governor's Republican, then they tend to have a basic agreement with each other, and in that way unify the government. Question number 2 is, why is money important in campaigns? And I listed some reasons here, and I'll just say something about it. Campaigns are expensive, like everything else in America, but they seem to be exponentially growing in terms of expenses. It used to be back in the say 70s or 80s, a campaign could be run for governor, and the gubernatorial candidate, even in a big state, would only spend about $1 million. And today, that kind of money is being spent at the local level for office. So the price of everything, whether it's TV or billboards or whatever way people advertise themselves as candidates, has gone up. And it's very, very expensive now to run at any level. A number of reasons is the media, especially TV, can be very expensive. Television depends on the market you're in, but if you're in a big city, so if you're buying television ads in Chicago or New York or someplace like that, it's very expensive. It might be cheaper in Peoria or Rockford or someplace like that, but for the most part, it's expensive, and it's going to be at least hundreds of thousands of dollars to use television commercials, because it isn't just buying the time on television and how big the audience reach is, but it's putting the commercials together and hiring professionals for every facet of a TV commercial, much like paying for it in the private sector if you're trying to advertise a product. So that's very expensive. Today it's not uncommon to pay volunteers. That always seems strange to me, because the whole notion of a volunteer was somebody who did it for free. But in this day and age, because it's so hard for candidates and parties to get volunteers, they pay them. So that's an expense that never used to be. Professional personnel are paid large salaries. So if you get a professional campaign manager to come in and run the gubernatorial campaign, or you get people to do polling's extremely expensive, and almost all the candidates want to use that as a method. It becomes very, 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 very costly. And then the last thing is that candidates no longer rely on the parties for financial support. It used to be, I mentioned that there was a party organization and the parties would, pay for it. Like, for example, in Chicago, if you're a Democratic candidate running for state office or local office, and you were picked by the Democratic Party of Cook County, then the party would pay for your whole election campaign, or no matter what you were paying for, whether that would be television or billboards or what have you. But today, that's not the case anymore. Today, essentially, candidates have to rely on raising the money themselves. That's one of the reasons, as we'll talk about later, that parties have become weakened and are no longer as powerful as they once were. Number three, why are the parties in decline? Well, the parties have lost control over the nomination process. That's the real reason why they're in decline. And they've done that because of, first of all, the primary system. The primary system replaced the convention system, which replaced the caucus. So you had basically what you could call a caucus in the beginning with political parties, where the leaders just got together and they picked somebody. Even I can remember when Mayor Daley, the first Mayor Daley of Chicago, was mayor. He was the head of the Democratic Party, and he got together with his cronies, and they just decided who the Democratic candidate would be for governor or any of the offices running in Chicago or in the state of Illinois. So you had that system, and people complained about it because they said it wasn't democratic enough. Party leaders were, choosing people that the public didn't really like, that sort of thing. So then we moved to the convention system, much like you sort of, a version of what you see when you see presidential conventions going on every 4 years. So you had delegates who supposedly represented the public, and then they would pick a candidate. And then that wasn't considered democratic enough, so then we went to a third system, which was and is primaries, and that is directly voting by directly having the public vote for the candidates, and then whoever the public picks then becomes the nominee of the party. So that's one of the reasons, and so you could see that what happened there is it took the power out of the hands of the party organization and party and government, and placed it in the hands of the party and the electorate. And that's not very effective in terms of being able to make the party work. Second thing is television. Television enables candidates, even unknown candidates, to bypass the party organization. Way back in the day in Chicago, there was Mayor Byrne. And Mayor Byrne, who just held a minor office in Chicago, took advantage of the fact that the party and the mayor, the existing mayor at the time, who was a temporary appointment after Mayor Daley died, the first Mayor Daley, when he died, there was a big snowstorm, and they didn't do a very good job at all of cleaning up the snow. And so she got on television with ads saying that if she was elected mayor, this virtual unknown person, Jane Byrne, that she would never have that happen again. And it was a very effective method, and she beat the party organization. So you have one of the strongest party organizations in the whole United States existing at that time in Chicago, and she beat it by using television ads. So that has really weakened the party organization all over, because it used to be that, in essence, before television, the party organization was a surrogate campaigner. Even for President of the United States, most people never saw, before television, they never saw the candidates. It's kind of hard to believe now. But they didn't know who they really were, not to see them. They could see pictures of them, but they didn't know what they sounded like, what they looked like, how they reacted to questions, all the kind of things that become part of television. And so, anyway, that has tremendously probably more than anything, weakened the parties. Another thing that happened, and again, this is largely as a result of television, that candidate image, that is what the candidate looks like, sounds like, and behaves, how the candidate behaves, became more important in the voter's mind, to the party in the electorate, and to the independents for that matter, over party. Before that, people would vote for a candidate based on their political party. And again, that seems kind of strange to us today because there's so much evaluation of candidates per se. I remember, for example, in the 1960 presidential election debates, that was the first presidential debates on television. The first candidate to get up and speak, I think they flipped a coin to decide whether it would be Nixon or Kennedy. And President Kennedy got up, he was Senator Kennedy then, and he got up and he said, "Vote for me because I'm a Democrat." And then he proceeded to talk about how good the Democratic Party was. Now, no candidate running for office in the 21st century would ever do that. It just shows you how diminished the parties have become. Another thing is the change in fundraising and the importance and role of interest groups in the fundraising process. It used to be, as I said, that the parties supported everybody, and where did they get their money? They got their money from loyal supporters of the party, whether that was people who were doing patronage jobs or just people who liked the Democrats or Republicans. But that's kind of gone to the wayside. They're not able to raise money like they did. And now it's interest groups. Interest groups are supporting both the Democrats and the Republicans, and oftentimes, depending on the place and circumstances, it's the same interest groups that support the Democrats and the Republicans. So I put it down here that there's been a rise of interest groups over parties. It used to be said by political scientists back in the 1950s that the stronger political parties were, the weaker interest groups were, and vice versa. And now what we've seen is we've really seen the rise of interest groups. As a matter of fact, the interest groups are so powerful in the political system that a lot of people who opt out of voting, just don't think it's worth much, are part of interest group politics. And that just goes to show you how important that aspect of government and politics has become. And the last one I would say is why the parties are in decline is you can have candidates without parties that they do have to run, technically, they do have to run as Democrats or Republicans, but they're really not Democrats or Republicans. And the reason I can say that without any hesitation is because they're not involved, or they have not been involved many times in the party itself before running for office. And you could see that with regard to a number of candidates who've run in, say, gubernatorial campaigns. An example would be Schwarzenegger, who ran as a Republican in California. He wasn't really a big-time Republican. He maybe did some minor things, but not much, not enough to be the candidate for governor, but he was elected by the public in primaries because he was a TV star, and I mean a movie star. Another good example would be President Trump. President Trump really wasn't active in the Republican Party. He just chose to get into the primaries on the Republican side because he felt like he was closer to that wing of a party than it would be. He was conservative, and he felt he would be closer to the Republicans than he would be to the Democrats. But he really wasn't a Republican in the strict sense of the way it used to be back in the day when before you ever became a candidate for office, even lower office, you worked in the campaign for other candidates of the party to show your loyalty. And if you go back to somebody like President Truman, President Truman started out as a precinct captain for the Democratic Party and then wound up running for president. Another one who did a lot of work for the party was President Nixon. A lot of people didn't like President Nixon, but in 1968, when he became the nominee, they felt they had to give it to him because he had been so loyal to the party. Last question is, how does state campaign financing compare to the national government? Let me just say that I can keep this one kind of short. There's a number of components to election finance, campaign finance laws. Campaign finance laws generally include four things: disclosure, that is the candidate saying like where the money came from and how they spent it; contribution limits, saying that you can only give a certain amount of money to any candidate. That's the second component. Back in the day, it was sort of a scandal that Nixon, I think President Nixon was the first one to receive $1 million from an outside source. And people thought that was awful. It was like buying a candidate. And so then they put limitations like $1,000 or $1,500, something like that, on any individual contribution. The third thing is public financing of elections. That is, if candidates qualify, then the public system where money's raised by asking the public in primaries to donate, then that money's used as for the candidates of the Democratic and Republican Party during the election, whether it's for governor or president or what have you. And then the third one is public financing of parties. There was also in campaign finance reform the idea that somehow you could give some of that public money to the parties and that would strengthen them and they could be stronger once again as they were back in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So those are the components. And then if we were to look at, and you can find this online, if you look at each state, you could see like what kind of disclosure laws do they have, what kind of campaign contributions do they have, campaign laws on contributions, campaign laws on financing of elections and parties. So anyway, to make it simple, you could probably say that leading the way in all of this is California, that they tend to be more on the cutting edge of having better disclosure laws and so on. And some of the other states, the big states, like New York and Massachusetts, also fall into those same categories. And then you have states like New Mexico, where they don't seem to be doing anything in regard to these things, like they never saw the campaign finance laws in the country. And this has been going on since the 1970s. These campaign finance reform laws have really been around with these components ever since Watergate, and an effort to kind of combat what happened in the 1972 election when President Nixon got reelected and you had all that scandal and everything with raising money. So in some ways, I think you could say that thanks to the Supreme Court that saying that money is speech, that in effect the national politics has kind of abandoned these things. But at the state level, in places like I mentioned, like California, New York, Massachusetts, maybe even Wisconsin you could throw in there, there's maybe 10 or 12 states that have some pretty serious campaign contributions. Their campaign finance reform, I should say, they're leading the way. And so as a result, there's a tendency for the states to be well ahead of the national government. And will probably stay that way for quite some time because it doesn't look like the Supreme Court is going to change anytime soon.